Hey, everybody. Welcome back. I'm Susan Linder, your host of the Innovation Storytellers Show. Thank you so much for joining me again. Today, we're going to take a little trip around the world of governance. Not to mention, we've been talking quite a bit on this show about how startups and grown-ups can work together. What is this beautiful synergy when it works? Because lots of times it doesn't, when startups and large corporates can actually get together and really fuel the innovation fire inside of large businesses. And that's why I'm really thrilled to have my friend and fellow workshop presenter and phenomenal speaker, coach, and frankly, professor of all things around this topic, Trena Blair. In her role as a CEO of a small company making a big global impact, this did not come about by accident. And we're going to hear more about this story from Trena in a moment. She is a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors, a global mentor, a non-executive director, and now author of the #1 Amazon bestseller in Australia and the #1 best new release here in the US, Decoding Global Growth: How Successful Companies Scale Internationally. And Trena's career has been marked by significant achievements in international business. As the founder and CEO of FD Global Connections, Trena combines her creative problem-solving skills and commercial acumen and extensive US and global business expansion experience to deliver really dream outcomes for her clients. Trena's worked in incredible places, and I'm going to let her tell you more about her extensive work in bridging the gap between startups, grown-ups, and the structures, governance, and scale that both sides of the bridge need in order to be successful. Trena, thank you so much for joining me.
Susan, it's wonderful to be here, and thank you for that very generous introduction.
Well, you and I have worked together helping to bring startups to the US, doing all different kinds of workshops together. But I'm so excited about your book and everything that's coming with it. So you have stepped in this world of innovation. You have lived in it for decades. Tell us a little bit how you got into this space.
Well, I grew up on a property, a ranch. My parents were small business owners, and as small business owners, you have to work hard, you have to be resilient, you have to be innovative because not everything goes well all the time on a ranch.
What? Is that true?
And so you had to be creative. So I've always had that spirit within me in watching my parents. And the other thing watching my parents is that there was no one stereotypical job that my mum would do or that my dad would do. So it was all hands in. It didn't matter what the role was. So coming from that upbringing, then I moved into corporate and worked both in Australia and in New York. And you might be able to hear the sirens going at the moment. But
Welcome to my little hometown.
and so I worked in financial services in Australia for many years. I've worked in corporate travel as well. And I have always been interested in innovation, in new products, new solutions that we can bring to the market, whether that be in corporate or whether I now do that with my own business. So how did I get into my own business? Well, that's actually quite an interesting story, as I've told that over the years now. So I've had my business 10 years. And when I did leave corporate, I was happy to do so. Then I thought I wanted to become a company director. So I qualified in Australia, as you mentioned in your introduction, Susan, as a company director. And the course in Australia is incredibly intensive, an exam at the end, and there was so much work that I put into that. Now, I graduated, I successfully passed the exams, and there was a graduation ceremony. Now, I wasn't 24. I've already graduated from college. I've already been to the ceremonies. I really didn't want to go to the graduation ceremony for the company, to the institute. Anyway, my husband literally pushed me out the door because he said, I saw how much work you did, so off you go. So off I went. And at the event, we're sitting in alphabetical order, waiting for our names to be called up. And the person sitting next to me said to me, so what's your pitch? And I said, financial services. corporate travel, lived and worked in New York. And he gave me his business card and he said, please call me tomorrow. So I rang Richard the next,
Easy.
yes, I rang him the next day, and Richard is a director at a B2B SaaS development company
Mhm.
in financial services. They build expense management solutions. In travel, they created one of the very first global distribution systems for travel. And he needed somebody to open and build an office in New York. And he said, can you help? So that was 10 years ago. That was where FD Global Connection started, and we've been going strong ever since.
Wow. Just that easy. It should all be that easy, right? But this is what preparation and sweat, right, actually get you to the quote
Yeah.
unquote luck that we all hope for. It's getting yourself into the right rooms and seated next to the right people.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And over the years, I've had countless exchanges in that way. So serendipity has just come together in so many unusual ways that I feel that it validates that I'm doing exactly what I should be doing now.
That's all fantastic. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about your book for a moment. Decoding Global Growth, How Successful Companies Scale Internationally.
Mm.
So large companies, of course, are doing this, know how to do this for a long time. But for the book, it's really important that large companies understand that startups are still learning these lessons.
Yes.
So just for our audience sake, I think it's really helpful to be a little empathetic when we're thinking about our M&A strategies, when we're thinking about the startups that are actively disrupting our markets, how we think about how these young companies are growing, experiencing growing pains. And while doing that, we're contemplating acquisitions, strategic investments, joint ventures together, all different kinds of creative ways that large companies and small companies can partner together, but also recognizing the risks of governance and just the standard what can happen with any startup in their fragile state along the way. So tell us a little bit, what was the impetus for writing the book, Trena?
Yeah, so it was supposed to be an activity or a project that would take 3 months during lockdown in Australia. Uh,
Sure,
and
should
it,
get a book.
it took 3 years actually, rather than 3 months.
There you
But
go.
it was off the back of one of my customers sharing with me that the way that I approach scale ups and the methodologies and the frameworks that we've adopted and built over the years are unique. And she was encouraging me to make it more open to businesses around the world. And of course, I was thinking about different ways that we could do that. The lockdown became a perfect time for me to start putting pen to paper. And so the book has now become the Bible, if you like, of taking a business from startup stage to scale up stage or growth stage. And it doesn't matter whether it's a startup in the US going to the UK or a scale up going from Singapore to Australia. The book is based on the agnostic around the markets in which the leaders operate and where they're going into. But
Mhm.
we also wanted to make it a journey. So these are the things that the businesses need to do first. And from a corporate perspective, which I know we're going to dive into, from a corporate perspective, there are some things that they need to look for in a early stage business that they're looking to partner with or MRA and so forth. And so we start with what is the capacity and the capability of a scale up to be able to go into a new market.
Mhm.
And then we look at, do they have the presence? Do they understand the market that they're going into? Do they understand it in terms of the customers that are there? There are so many leaders that call me and they have very little idea of the culture that they're going into. They have little idea about the fact that potential customers will have different needs and they will need to invest in product development. A lot of those businesses feel that because they've been successful in one market, they simply pick up their business and plonk it in the other market and it will be successful. So
Mm.
a lot of work we do is around coaching them to say, you need to understand the market before you scale. You also need to ensure that your business is assessed, that it can scale. And when you're looking at partners, whether that's distribution, whether that's JVs, you need to think about what that means from a culture perspective. Because what I often see between early stage companies and corporations is it often fails because of cultural differences within both organizations.
Which is such a huge deal. Well, let's get to this assessment because I don't know that lots of companies have a very formal assessment process. They have their quote unquote due diligence, right? Which seems to vary massively between companies. How do you get started assessing whether or not the startup you're considering is a good fit?
So there are 7 different areas that we look at in the assessment. Primarily, it's about the capability and capacity. And so we look at their risk management structure as number one, from whether they've got the board in place, whether that's an advisory committee or a governance board, and then what that risk management structure looks like internally. Because ultimately, when you're scaling into a new country, it's all about managing risk. So risk management is a really important element of that audit. We also look at resilience because resilience is another really key element of the audit. So if you've got a team that you've been working with, they've gone from prototype to startup, they're now scale up, they've invested not only possibly their own money, but a lot of time. They've been taken away from their families. They're working on weekends. They're working long hours. Resilience of leaders and teams of scale-ups is really important to understand.
Mm.
We also look at the leadership team itself and the skills and the characteristics of that leadership team. So we have what we call the business growth life cycle. As a business grows, what we recommend is the leadership skill set also grows. So as a startup leader, you're very directive. You know exactly what needs to be done. You need exactly what development needs to be done, who does what. You are very directive. As a scale-up leader, you cannot do everything. And so making sure that you have the delegated authority in place to manage the risks that you are delegating, that's a critical piece of delegation. So as corporates are talking to scale-up leaders, that's one area in particular that I would be asking the scale-ups. Tell us about your leadership structure. Who do you have in place? If you've got a CEO or a founder that thinks they can do everything, that's a massive call out for me, a massive risk. We also look at financials, of course. So you need to have the cash runway to be able to scale.
I recall a company that I was working with that got acquired by IBM, and the founders received an Excel spreadsheet that was 300 lines long. And it was a checklist of everything you needed to do in order to be assimilated into IBM. And that spreadsheet was affectionately called blue washing, or the brainwashing of joining IBM, right?
Yes.
That you would become part of the furniture essentially, which was always fascinating to me, that the reason that this startup was so effective, so dynamic, et cetera, was because it had its own great culture. And there wasn't even a discussion as to whether or not you would maintain any of that business, that all the stuff that made that startup sparkle in the M&A team's eyes. It was not even a question whether or not you'd be able to keep it.
Yes, yes. And it is very common. And earlier I mentioned it's often the cultures between the two organizations, the scale-ups and the established companies, that really bring everything undone. Scale-ups by culture, agile, they're fast moving. They're under pressure because they don't have a lot of capital. So they're under
Right.
pressure financially. Corporates, on the other hand, have very well established processes. Procurement can take a long time. Going through risk assessment can take a very long time. And so you've got these two dynamics going, and this is where they often clash. And it's really vital for the corporates to understand what the culture is of that smaller, agile scale up, and also for the scale up to understand what they're going to be facing when they engage. There are corporates that actually do this really well, and it's not through luck, it's been through great planning. And also because they've got some really talented, they've recruited talented individuals that have been in the startup space. So they actually understand the pressures and the culture of a scale up as they're engaging a corporation. So having somebody within the business on the corporate side that understands the culture of both organizations and helping the startup or the scale up, navigate through. But also the corporates have to be able to pick up the pace a bit faster than what they would traditionally do. So having a big blue washing spreadsheet, as a small business owner, I would be hesitating with that, I have to be honest.
And that was like take it or leave it kind of approach. And IBM had the power to do that. I have a friend who worked in one of France's biggest startup accelerators, and he was lured away by the Walmart of France. And they said, we want you to be in charge of keeping an eye out for what startups we should acquire. He was like, fantastic. He made a wish list of all the companies that he wanted to acquire, got together with the CFO's team, who would love to take long leisurely lunches discussing the pros and cons of each, which was driving him absolutely insane. He said, I recognize that the difference between working at a startup and working in a large company is that I create 6 really good ideas. I then watch as 40 people are CC'd on these emails that circulate. And then I sit back and wait 6 weeks while the consensus bus pulls into each bus stop around all the different silos, picking up decisions, et cetera, until basically the startup is absolutely exhausted trying to answer the questions of 40 stakeholders in one decision.
Yeah, absolutely. The alignment process
Uh-huh.
in corporations is it really does demotivate a lot of startups. It really does.
I mean, it can really crush them.
Absolutely, absolutely. The matrix reporting, I don't have responsibility. I have to need to refer to somebody else in matrix structures in corporations. These are all the things that inhibits the opportunity for those corporates to access some really great solutions for their customers.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit. So you've worked with some amazing companies. I want to talk a little bit about how companies really begin to understand governance for growth, because I think we all know that there's huge risk involved, right? It's probably one of the riskiest things that a company can do is acquire another company. There are so many variables that could go wrong, right? And as you're thinking about working with a company that's actively scaling, right? That's not necessarily the most stable organization on the planet. How do you begin to introduce governance for growth? And maybe you can give us some examples of how that worked, like places like MasterCard and working with young fintech companies.
Yeah, absolutely. So this actually came about in a relatively interesting way. So as I said in the introduction, I qualified as a company director and I sit on boards in Australia. But this all started because I was a mentor at a startup hub, the fintech startup hub in Australia. And I started running pro bono workshops for the founders about governance and their fiduciary responsibilities as directors. Even in Australia, you register your company under the Australian Securities Insurance Commission, and you automatically become a company director. So you are legally liable for that company. And they didn't understand that. So I'm not quite sure what they understood, but they, at that base level, they had no clue what that meant.
Shouldn't we know? Shouldn't we know this?
Right? Shouldn't we know? So I kept doing these workshops because the liability on them was significant, even as a startup. So
Uh-huh.
the next thing I know, the Australian Institute engaged me, Australian Institute of Company Directors, to develop a 1-year program for 50 female scale-ups. And what it was around was making sure that they understood how you go from an early stage company through to a business that has investors, and then what that does to your governance, and then what happens in a highly regulated industry, what that looks like from a governance perspective.
Mm.
So that was a really interesting one-year program that we supported these 50 female founders through that pathway. And then MasterCard in Australia heard about the program that I'd run. And what MasterCard, they invest, as we all know, in companies around the world, fintechs around the world. And again, I created a bespoke program for them, which was for their fintechs. And we took the fintechs on that journey again. So as an early stage fintech, you have lots of mentors. And this is in my book, by the way, so I'm not sharing any inside secrets here.
Darn it.
I talk a lot about governance for growth in the book, and it starts with mentors, right? So, and many corporate employees are mentors, and this is an area that I think they can add a lot of value to a startup. So mentors are your first level of governance, but then as the business grows, it becomes into an advisory committee. And often that's the case when investors do come into the business. They're looking for that oversight. And an advisory committee means they don't have, whoever sits on that advisory committee doesn't have that fiduciary or that legal responsibility to the entity. And the other great thing is not only does the founder get access to some brilliant minds, but it's advisory only. They don't need to implement what the committee has said they should be implementing. So it's still up to the founder to decide and have that control. But the next level is a governance board, and that's heavy duty, serious governance where the directors do have fiduciary responsibility. So we see that in a highly regulated industry like financial services. And the next piece is international governance. So if you're a fintech coming out of Australia, going into the UK or into the United States, you've got your governance board in Australia. But what do you now need from a board perspective doing that international expansion? So we talked about all of those different steps and the tools that businesses, the fintechs, could have access to through that MasterCard program.
Wow. So, and the governance there is, it's equal education, right? For the startup and the corporate.
It is, yes, absolutely. So what's really interesting about it, and the feedback I often get from the fintechs or indeed any startup, is they're nervous about sharing the risks that they've got in the business. But by virtue of what they're doing, they're a risky enterprise. So there should be no surprise when a corporate starts engaging them that there are risks in the business. We know that 90% of all startups will fail. We know that. That's not a surprise. So for the corporates to go in and to help with identifying the real risks in the business, and typically that will start with the financials. But as I mentioned earlier, there are other risks that could be looked at, like the resilience, like the leader and their capability and skill set. So there's some of the other risks, but not to be scared about sharing those. And I think that's a really important piece for startups and corporations to be able to work together. Now, the other piece around identifying those risks, like I've seen as a company director, I get reports at board level, reams and reams and reams of pages in an Excel spreadsheet of all the risks in the business. Yeah, that's great. I know there's going to be hundreds of risks in the business. As an early stage company, you don't need to do that. So what I recommend, and you don't have the time, by the way. So what I suggest to the startup founders is give me one page of your top 5 risks. Your financials is always going to be your number 1, but what are your others? Only one page, that's all we want. And so and I ask them to do that even with their mentors, even at that early stage, that very early stage, because as they go through that governance pathway from a committee to governance board, what I want them to do is, 1, feel comfortable about sharing their risks. That number 2 is they've started to get those practices in place. And as a corporate, And my experience is when I look at a scale up from a corporate size, if I can see that there's that pathway that they've been on, looking at their risks and they've got the processes around that, I'm much more comfortable working with them, investing in them and engaging them than what I would be than a founder that simply comes to me. You ask them for their risk profile, their risk assessments in the last 12 months. I'm much more comfortable working with those that understand that really well.
Well, so let's take this example and shift this in, because you've worked on so many different levels with this, kind of being the bridge, someone who really knows how to cross these chasms between young companies and formed companies. Yeah, I'm thinking about your work at Discover, for example. Tell us, can you give us an example of like what's going through the mind? I'm sure so many of my listeners have these eager plans, and frankly, the M&A market has been so soft over the last year or two. There's a lot of optimism that the M&A markets are going to turn around. Tell us a little bit more about your work there, and what does it mean to have somebody who gets to be a bridge, to be an interpreter of what's happening?
Yeah, so the engagement with Discover was we started speaking in 2018.
Hmm.
To Discover we're looking for was to build their brand in the fintech ecosystem in the UK. And because of my background, both in corporate and also working with scale ups for fintechs in Australia, scaling internationally, I had a good network in the UK to be able to tap into. But more importantly, if you're looking to go into the UK to build your brand, even as a large corporation, it's not easy because, as many of your listeners I'm sure know, the UK and New York are par on par with having the biggest fintech ecosystems on the planet. So differentiating yourself going into that market, into a very crowded market, required something really special. So it was the conversations with the Discover team here in the US that we really pinpointed specifically what it was that they wanted to achieve. And it was about them not only increasing awareness of their brand, but also potential opportunities for them to invest in fintechs that we uncovered. But first, we had to create an event that would attract the fintechs, again, in a very crowded market. So we designed a one-day event, and it was a fantastic collaboration between the Discover team, both here in the United States, in the UK, and my team in Australia. And I also had a team here in Manhattan that we worked together. And so it was a global effort. We created a one-day conference, and the ultimate objective was that we were then going to go across Europe. So if it was successful in the UK and London, we were going to take that model and then apply it to build the brand of Discover in those eight other cities across Europe. The London event was fantastic. It was unique. We had some incredible guest speakers that were perhaps a little bit unusual for a fintech conference, but the
How
messaging.
so?
Well, one of the things that we did up front was we had a debate, and the debate was around whether or not fintech was actually a valuable thing for the economy. And so we had on one side a debater talking about the positive impact of fintech on the local economy. And on the other side was a debater saying, well, actually, no, there's not a benefit, not a financial or economic benefit. So it was entertaining. We had two speakers that were both quite humorous, and we just captured the attention of the audience. The other thing that we did was live mentoring. And so we secured three, and this is 2018, 2019, remember, so we're going back quite a few years. We secured, I think it was 2 or 3 fintechs out of London, and they did their pitch. And we had mentors in the audience from corporates, including Discover, that gave them live feedback. That was pretty advanced at that time. So I know it's quite common now. So there were some things that we did that were unique for the time. And it was very successful. Discover team were absolutely, so thrilled with the outcomes that we achieved. So then we started planning Europe, and then COVID got in the way, so it was all stopped.
Ugh, that COVID. Whoever's responsible for that, knock it off. That's what I
Absolutely.
would say about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
So give us your best advice. If I'm sitting there as a chief innovation officer, I have my strategy, right? I take this portfolio approach to looking at increment, like 3 horizons innovation, right? Improving on what's currently here, kind of creating product extensions in horizon 2, and then maybe even looking at horizon 3 for product breakthrough products. Where do you see, what's the best formula? That's not even the right question to ask. What is the best mindset to adopt in thinking about including startups as part of the innovation pipeline?
Great question. First of all, I would say from a corporate perspective, I think about whether there's always a willingness to try to engage those earlier stage companies, right? They do offer so much if you get it right. But you really have to be honest with yourself about your company and whether there is that willingness to adapt the culture to be able to accommodate the culture of the earlier stage startup, as I was talking about earlier. I think that's a really critical. So honestly, do an assessment on your own business, on your corporation, about whether there is truly that desire. Because as I said before, that startup is heavily reliant on securing your contract for their financial viability and sustainability. So don't engage if your company is unwilling to consider changing and speeding up some of those processes that need to be sped up. Procurement, even something as fundamental as your payment cycle. There are corporations, your billing cycle is 120 days. That is unreasonable. I'm sorry, but it is unreasonable for a early stage company to expect them to wait 120 days from delivering the service. So have a think about those sort of processes that you can speed up. So culture, I think, is a really important piece. The other really important piece, I think, is sponsors. And having internal sponsors in the corporation above you in that leadership hierarchy, I think is absolutely critical as well. Because if you're running solo within your corporation, you've got the energy, you've got the enthusiasm, that's great, but you need to see that way up the hierarchy as well, so that you've got the support and that you can engage your leaders where those roadblocks exist. So they would be the 2 things that I would suggest.
Fantastic. Okay, now I'm going to ask you the 3 questions I ask everyone who comes on the show. Number 1, what is the greatest innovation of all time?
Books.
Books. Yeah, but where would we be without them? And to your point, you are now a new author. So there you go.
That was, yeah. Okay, that question was not a setup question.
It's not.
Sorry.
Okay, step 2. I love it. Step 2 is, if you had the opportunity to join any innovation team in the course of human history, which team would you have joined?
I don't know who it was, but somewhere in Egyptian history, they developed the wheel. So I think that's ultimately revolutionized the world. So the wheel team, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's like two women and a hammer. Is that what it is? Plucking out a piece of granite, right? Or some piece of stone, or maybe it was wood being put together.
Yeah. It might go back to the Copper Age, the Stone Age, perhaps. I don't know, but somewhere along the line, they created this thing that goes around and they realized you could move it. And look at it now.
And lastly, what's something that really irritates you or something that you wish existed in the world that does not? What needs to be innovated now?
Oh, I wish that there was an AI tool that could read my mind and do my to-do list without me having to either type or write it down.
So some kind of embedded or wearable that knows your to-do list. Isn't that just an incredible level of emotional labor that we just carry around with us all day?
Yeah, exactly. And at night, pondering early hours of the morning, I've got to do this, I've got to do that. So I'm not sure about an injectable that would be able to do that, but certainly a wearable I'd be open to.
There you go. We'll take it. Trena Blair, what is the best place for people to get in contact with you?
We have our website, www.fdglobal.com.au, or email me, Trena with an E, trena.blair@fdglobal.com.au, or LinkedIn. Yeah.
LinkedIn, always the easy common denominator.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining me on the show today, Trena.
Okay. Thank you, Susan. Great to have you. Bye.